Evening, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever we find you. Welcome to Heterodox Academy and another member spotlight. For those of you tuning in for the first time, I'm Kyle Vitale, Director of Programs here at HxA, and I'll be briefly introducing the evening and our speaker. For those of you who are joining us not for your first time, I know you've heard me say that a lot. It's great to see you again and looking forward to spending the evening together. Just a quick note that because we are in a Zoom room and not a webinar, we very much appreciate you keeping your mics muted. We like to keep these spotlights a bit more organic, so there will be an open question period later on. In the meantime, we appreciate your attention to mic etiquette, as the first half of this event is recorded and will go on our YouTube channel. And speaking of, hello to our viewers who are watching this later on our YouTube channel. If you are new to HxA's work, Heterodox Academy is a nonpartisan nonprofit committed to improving research and education by increasing open inquiry, viewpoint diversity, and constructive disagreement in higher education. We have more than 5,000 members from institutions across the country and around the globe. If you're interested in our community, resources, exclusive events, and programs, it is free to join, and you can visit heterodoxacademy.org/join to learn more. Just a quick note that if you enjoy this evening's event, we are running our Member Spotlight series all fall. Please check out our events page on the website for upcoming events, including next week's exclusive documentary screening entitled The Abortion Talks, which will also feature a post-discussion with the filmmakers. More events are being announced in the coming weeks as well, so we encourage you to stay tuned. So let's turn to this evening. Our theme this fall is higher education in an ailing republic. How can teaching, writing, and research contribute to improving our democracy and improve itself for the sake of our democracy? Our speaker in his research tonight has some answers. Tonight's event will be in two parts. The first will be our speaker's address. This will be recorded for our YouTube channel, so for those of you who are just joining, we strongly encourage you to keep your mics off. Part two will be live and unrecorded. That'll be a Q&A with our speaker. I'll invite questions via Zoom's raise hand function or by typing into the chat. As always, this is HxA, so we encourage challenging, authentic questions asked in good faith and constructively. And finally, I'm pleased to introduce our speaker. Kevin Marinelli serves as Teaching Associate Professor in the Department of Communication and Executive Director of the Program for Public Discourse at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. His scholarship examines the rhetoric of public argument. As a scholar and an educator, he's especially interested in the role of value claims in public discourse. And with that, Kevin, I'm going to pass it off to you.
All right. Thanks, Kyle. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for letting me hang out with you tonight. It's great to be here. And I am going to share my screen so I can share my presentation with you. So I'm going to keep this to a hopefully brief 25-minute presentation before I turn it over to you, where we can hopefully spark a robust, spirited discussion. But what I want to do today is share with you some of my strategies promoting civic discourse at the University of North Carolina in my capacity as Executive Director of the Program for Public Discourse at UNC-Chapel Hill. The program is in its fourth year, and I'm at my third year at the university. So I want to begin with just a snapshot of UNC because I think it's important first to consider your own institutional constraints, most importantly being your students. Who are your students? What are their concerns? Where are they coming from? And how can you most effectively engage them where they are? So here's a little bit about UNC that informs some of our constraints, what we can do, can't do, should do, shouldn't do, and our demographics, which gives us a glimpse, but certainly not the whole picture of who our students are and what their concerns might be. which brings us to the Program for Public Discourse, or PPD, as we call it. Our motto at the PPD is promoting civic virtue, fostering civil debate. We do believe that civic virtue does derive in part from robust discourse, but the form of that discourse is open to debate itself. So we have debate in our motto and we don't shy away from it, but that's not to say that we privilege it either. And that's something that itself is and can be contested. There are many modes of discourse, including dialogue and deliberation. And one thing I encourage my students to do is consider their trade-offs. So I think debate can be a great tool, but I don't think it's the only tool. I think dialogue can be a great tool, but I think that also has limitations. And I'm also wary of reactionary tendencies to privilege one mode or another, which will be a theme throughout my presentation and hopefully our discussion this evening. But some of our objectives at the PPD is to strengthen democracy in public life, prepare students to lead and serve, develop student capacities for deliberation, empower students to speak openly and frankly, and foster a vibrant campus climate of constructive dialogue. And I'm sure these objectives overlap with your own institutions and departments. But I do want to focus just a little bit on the fourth item there, empowering students to speak openly and frankly, because part of that is inspired by a research project, an ongoing research project that a few of my colleagues are engaged in that examines the climate of discourse across the UNC system. And they found some interesting things. First and foremost, they found that free expression is not really suffering on campus, which is a good thing. But it does have hurdles. And one of those hurdles is that they do notice students do tend to self-censor in the classroom. And they also observe that conservative identifying students do tend to self-censor more than liberal identifying students. The second thing they notice is that students appear much more concerned with the lash of their peers rather than their faculty, which cuts against the common narrative that students are afraid of their teachers. It turns out that they tend to be more afraid of each other. But I think it's a good place to begin, a good research project. But I also think it leaves room for development. And one area that I would encourage them to develop this research is in the realm of qualitative studies. So rather than just self-reporting data, I'd like to hear students explain what these terms mean to them. When they identify as censoring, what do they mean by that? When they talk about free expression, what do they mean by those things as well? Okay, so the Program for Public Discourse engages in several modes of engagement across campus. I do a lot of faculty workshops and consultations with faculty who are interested in incorporating more deliberation into the classroom. I work especially with folks who may not have as much experience with deliberative practices, people coming from the life sciences, for example, who understand the importance of deliberation in the classroom, but may not have the tools and experiences to do it. We do a lot of public events that aim to demonstrate robust discussion and debate for our members and for our campus. This is probably the most visible part of what we do. We're trying to foster more community partnerships, which I'll get into a little later on. And of course, the thing that comes foremost is student development. And one branch of student development is what I call the Agora, which I'll touch on toward the end. But the bulk of my talk today will stem from the Symposium of Collegiate Programs for Public Discourse, which I was able to host last spring, made possible by grant funding from HxA. So thank you, HxA, and all of our sponsors. But this was a terrific event. We were able to invite 14 fabulous scholars and program directors from across the country. We engaged an array of deliberative models. and approaches to fostering discourse. It sparked a faculty working group at the end, and also a deliberative resource manual that's now posted on our website at the Program for Public Discourse. So we encourage you to check that out. You can look at the recordings and also the proceedings from the event and summaries of the presentations. All of the presentations were fabulous, but I want to focus on 5 presentations and themes in particular. So here we go. I'll begin with Martine Carcassonne, a rhetorical and public deliberation scholar at Colorado State University. And Martine directs the Center for Public Deliberation at CSU. And Martine is a leading scholar on the topic of wicked issues in the field of communication and public deliberation. Wicked issues comes from the sciences, and Martine situates it within public deliberation in particular. So what exactly is a wicked problem? A wicked problem or wicked issue could be any issue of public controversy. But specifically, a wicked problem comprises multiple values, and it puts those values in tension, often contradiction with one another, which leads to either or politics, false dichotomies, polarization, et cetera, et cetera. So why do wicked problems matter, and how do they emerge? Well, drawing on the scientific literature, it demonstrates that human beings are not quite wired for nuanced deliberation. We're much more wired for outrage and polarization. It's very easy to create either or dichotomies and extrapolate them into us-them dichotomies. We're good, they're evil or wicked. And what Martine wants to do is to take the wickedness out of the problem, or excuse me, out of the person and into the problem. How can we think of these as wicked problems rather than wicked issues? And the wicked issue lens helps extract the nuance of these thorny issues. So to give an example here of some different frameworks, a simple framework he would say is capitalism versus socialism. I think we can all understand that false dichotomy there. An intermediate framing would be equity versus equality. So this gets a little more interesting now. So for a long time, we spoke about equality. And more recently, the term equity has been introduced into the conversation. But how it's deployed is interesting and sometimes combative. So even though equity gives the opportunity to have a more nuanced discussion of, say, fairness and other things, it can also be a combative term. If someone talks about equality and another person calls that person out and says, you don't get it, it's about equity, it's not about equality, then it creates a wicked problem there. It creates a false dichotomy. It's pitting these two things against each other when they don't have to be. So a more nuanced framing, or a wicked issues framing, according to Martine, would be equity and equality, freedom and security, structure and agency, thinking about how these things can complement each other rather than oppose one another. So there are 4 key shifts that happen when we employ a wicked issues perspective. One, again, we take the wickedness out of the person and put it into the problem. We move from adversaries to collaborators. We move from inciting the worst of human behavior to the best of human nature. And we move from cherry picking facts to utilizing facts for problem solving rather than, say, winning a debate. Building off of this, I want to turn next to Rhonda Fitzgerald of the Sustained Dialogue Institute, and her talk is Identifying Stuck Points in Public Discourse. But by stuck point, she's using this term in a specific way, and it's not the way that I might think of it as a rhetorical scholar. When I think of a stuck point, I think of stasis, or the point of contention between two interlocutors. And Rhonda's using it in a different way here. For her, a stuck point is not the contention in the debate, but it involves your identity role in the issue itself. So what Ron is going to say is, too often faculty assume we just put people in a room together and they're going to overcome their resistance. They'll increase their student readiness to embrace their ideas. But the research suggests that's not the case. That's not going to happen, since certain stuck points won't be explored in that model. So what does she propose? The research suggests that it's better to meet people where they are when entering the discussion. Thus, the sustained dialogue facilitators begin by grouping participants according to their identified role levels. So what do we mean by these role levels? So again, Rhonda is going to draw from some outside literature here, in the case of James Marcia's work in sociology on 4 different roles. And to be clear, these aren't designed to translate neatly into public deliberation, but nevertheless, I think they work effectively. So the first role we can identify is role achievement, which assumes a committed role regarding this particular issue, a role of advocacy, say. The second would be role moratorium, actively exploring but not committed to a stance. Third, role foreclosure, firmly committed without even exploring the issue. And then finally, role diffusion, has not committed or explored. So what Rhonda is going to say is, what you want to do is identify the roles of your participants and then split them into different groups to deliberate with one another before they deliberate across their different roles. And so here's how this model or this structure looks in her model. And she's very clear, we don't need to use these terms with them. That might be a little insulting and it's not necessary, but just by talking with students or your participants, whoever they are, about their relationships and attitudes to these issues, you can learn about them and where you might want to categorize them to begin the conversation. And so each group would join a specific facilitator to deliberate with each other before moving on to deliberating across these roles. So what's the outcome here? Well, we hopefully learn to meet people where they are. We better gauge when dialogue is useful and when it is not. And we can strike unhelpful questions such as, who has an authentic role in this conversation, to how do I have an authentic role in this conversation? And recognizing that that might look different for different people, and that's okay. And hopefully participants leave feeling heard and empowered. Connected to Rhonda's desire to scaffold the deliberative process, Leila Bremer, the director of the PPD program of Public Discourse at Chicago, has a similar call to scholars, but she's going to frame it a little bit differently. So she wants to rethink the role of free expression in public discourse. But free expression is typically funneled through a liberal political model of individual rights. And Leila is going to argue that that's a very limited way to think about freedom of expression. We can expand that to include questions about capacities for to engage difference and disagreement, recognizing that the level of discourse is not discursive, or excuse me, the level of discourse, excuse me, the playing field is not level. That's what I'm trying to say as I take a glass of water. So when we engage, we must ensure we hear a multiplicity of perspectives. In both of these issues, she says, the ethical on one hand and the technical or capacity model on the other, they both fall on discourse. So these both fall under our purview and give us a new way of thinking about free expression. So what Leila wants to do is similar to what Rhonda advocates, in that we should scaffold the deliberative model, but she's going to frame it a little bit differently. So rather than just think about scaffolding it in terms of role identities of your participants, scaffold the models of discourse themselves. if you think about this from a rhetorical perspective, Aristotle famously defines rhetoric as the counterpart or antistrophos of dialectic. So we have dialectic, the discussing of ideas with one another, and then that advances into a more formal rhetoric or advocacy of ideas. And what Leela is going to say is that too often as educators, we jump to the final part. We jump to the debate, we jump to the advocacy without giving students a chance to deliberate and unpack these issues, which is highly irresponsible. And she uses the metaphor of medical school and says, you wouldn't put a medical student in the operating table on their first day. First, they're going to learn about medicine and they're going to learn about the body before you put them in the operating room. And so essentially, the traditional debate model of public discourse puts students in the operating room way too early before they learn, again, how to unpack issues and deliberate about them effectively and responsibly. And so an alternative model may be to, say, dialogue an issue before moving to deliberating an issue, before moving to debating an issue, if you move to that at all. And again, that itself can be up for debate or deliberation. But one thing that she wants to do is overcome these either or frameworks that debate often poses. So similar to what Rhonda and Martine are saying in terms of thinking about wicked issues and how we can be more collaborative. Entering students as advocates fails students in developing their capacities to understand these issues. And so instead, we don't have to take it as a given that we're polarized. Instead, we have to think about how discursive practices are polarizing. So we can implement discursive practices that disrupt that polarity. So develop more of an Aristotelian scaffolding of discourse. Test ideas together rather than against each other. Make discourse collaborative. And after thoroughly discussing and deliberating, we can move to advocating. So utilize models that disrupt the either or dichotomy. But does that mean that conflict and dissonance are bad? Not necessarily. And that's where we can transition into Ryan Solomon, also at the Parisia program at Chicago, who's going to talk about reclaiming liberal democratic values in public deliberation. So really taking up the other side of that coin. He wants to remind us of a few things. First, conflict and dissonance are inherent to dialogue and deliberation. That polarization is an inescapable part of democratic life. So the challenge then is to stay committed to democratic values along with equality and inclusion in the face of that conflict. So we have two dominant critiques of polarization that present two concerns, according to Ryan. First, interlocutors are forced to acquiesce to a neutral stance, and then polarization becomes the problem, leading to more calls for civility. So he's going to say too often calls for viewpoint diversity express a language of balance and nonpartisanship, which comes at the expense of ideals such as equality and inclusion, which results in a false equivalence of perspectives. And this call for civility translates often to don't offend me, the upshot of which is to reinforce the status quo. So different forms of polarization, he argues, have to be treated differently. So then our challenge becomes to empower students to be resilient to uncomfortable ideas, to challenge the narrative pitting free speech and democracy against equality and inclusion, as I think we'd all agree at HxA, and not to confuse exclusion for neutrality. So how do we do that? Here's where I want to turn to the final presentation that I'm going to discuss from the symposium, and that's Van Hillard's talk. Van Hillard represents Davidson College in the Deliberative Citizenship Initiative. He's now Professor Emeritus. But his talk is titled Deliberative Traces in Academic Discourse. So thinking about how we can recenter the deliberation in academia. Okay. So he's going to argue that deliberation is a key virtue in liberal education, that it's a normative feature, not just a mode of discourse. In other words, it's an inflection of all discursive practices, not just one type of discourse that we choose to do. And intellectual deliberation is a microcosm of communal deliberation, not exclusive and not just one branch of it, but a microcosm of the very thing that we're trying to foster in our students. So he's going to argue deliberation is an intellectual practice, and the academy should be treated as a house of deliberation, built on the foundation of social reasoning. The teaching of writing and speaking then presents opportunities for developing deliberative literacy as an intellectual toolkit for private and public life. So we can look for metadiscourse in our scholarship and teach it to our students. So what is metadiscourse? Quite simply, it's language about other language. These could be signals, qualifiers, governors, emphasizing that we care about the experiences of our interlocutors. It's where kindness appears in argument. But I want to caution you not to dismiss this approach merely as niceties, because that's not at all what Van is saying. Instead, there's a real substance to these metadiscursive practices, which we'll examine here. So here are a few examples of metadiscursive questions and prompts that he offers. By qualifying the statement, as she does, is the author being deferential or prudent? So there's a few things going on here. It is a metadiscursive question about the tone of the writing. There's an ethical dimension to it, but there's also a substantive dimension to it that really digs into the argument itself and how the stylistic choices create that argument. Is it necessary to capitalize Black when referring to a group of people? Again, a metadiscursive question that touches on some very thorny political issues, and a couple prompts as well that you can offer to students to foster some metadiscursive thinking. Instead of beginning with, what do you think about X, try asking, what have others said about this topic, and how do you account for their differing positions? Or assign a short essay describing a change in orientation that developed over the semester, what and why. And I also want to add here that in our faculty resource manual from the symposium, we've included Van's document, which does a great job delineating a whole host of questions that you can ask strategically with your interlocutor in certain discursive moments to help you navigate those exchanges. And again, the point here is not to be polite, but to help navigate more substantively through these difficult discussions where they typically get blocked or shut down. And with that, I want to turn to some of my own work in student development. This symposium helped me think about a lot of things in relation to what is most effective in fostering public discourse and what practices we should be engaging with our students. A few years ago, when I came to UNC, one of the first things I did was create a group we called the Agora, which was an informal group of students, a cohort of undergraduates committed to the study and practice of public discourse outside the classroom. And since then, it's evolved, and most recently, we refined it to a more formal organization that we call fellowship. So it's the Agora Fellowship now, and students earn a stipend for going through the program. And it includes a 4-week training program. And if you look at the sequence of sessions, you'll notice I take some inspiration here from some of these themes in the symposium. So we begin with listening before transitioning to dialogue and deliberation, before we transition to facilitation, and then argumentation is the last thing we do. So facilitation is something That's important to us. We do want to prepare our students to be effective facilitators, but it's not the only thing. And as Leela points out, we can't simply depend on facilitators to do the work for us, that we have to empower people to be effective deliberators outside of the spaces where they find helpful facilitators. So they engage in this training program, but they still engage topical issues throughout the year, but now they're also equipped to facilitate campus events, engaging students and student concerns. And we allow them to choose the topics because they understand better what their classmates care about than we do. And we also partner with community organizations. For example, next semester, we're working with the Kidzu Children's Museum, which is a local museum in Chapel Hill. And it's really fascinating, the backstory to this project. Last year, they were promoting the vaccine. And one of the children there said, you know, I really want to get the vaccine, but my parents don't want me to, or don't like the vaccine or don't trust it. And I'm not sure how to talk about this with them. And so it was this aha moment of, here's something we can do, not advocate the vaccine in particular, but empower children and their caretakers to navigate some of these challenging topical issues more effectively around the dinner table and elsewhere. So next semester, we're going to invite children and their caretakers to engage in these practice sessions where we scaffold some deliberative practices while engaging some topical issues. And we're going to work with children very young, 2nd through 5th grade. But, you know, I think we often begin too late teaching deliberative practices. So I'm really excited to see where that goes. With that, I will stop talking and turn it over to you. So thank you for your time.
Thanks so much, Kevin. This is fantastic. So much to think about here and to talk about. So we are now going to turn to a time of questions and answers and conclude our recorded portion. For those who are watching this recording later, thanks so much for checking us out. And we warmly invite you to attend a live event soon and join the conversation.